It's March 20th, the first day of a new season, but in 3 days, Canada will enter campaign season to kick off spring. Prime Minister Mark Carney is expected to trigger an election by this Sunday, and sources tell us he'll visit the Governor-General and ask her to dissolve the Parliament. That means voters will likely go to the polls either Monday, April 28th or Monday, May 5th. And that means the campaign will be well underway when U.S. President Donald Trump announces reciprocal global tariffs on April 2nd. So Canada will have to fight back while in a caretaker government. And here to help us understand what that means for Canada is former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick. He is now the Jarislowsky Chair in Public Sector Management at the University of Ottawa. Michael Wernick, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for the invitation.
So we're going to go into the Caretaker Convention. Practically explain what that means in terms of how the government functions and what limits are placed on its actions.
Sure. I think it's a useful refresher in sort of the basic, governance of the country. This is the fourth election in less than 10 years, so both the public service and the political parties are pretty well practiced at it. I think the thing that sometimes people don't get is we always have a government. We always have a government. The ministers are the ministers, and the government has all of its powers under the hundreds of pieces of legislation that have been passed by Parliament. So the heart of the convention is to use those powers with restraint. And the British call this the Convention of Restraint. During a period when Parliament is dissolved, which presumably will start on Sunday, until the next government is sworn in, you don't have a Parliament to hold the executive part of government answerable.
Right.
So the idea is you should be very restrained then in the use of your executive powers. You shouldn't start big new things, and you should try to avoid taking decisions that are irreversible or difficult for the next government, to act on. So in practice, almost everything a government does is reversible. So there aren't really that many cases that have come up in the last 20 years. But it's really that idea of trying to do the least possible, defer what you can.
Right.
The point here is the convention, very clearly says government's still the government and should deal with emergencies and deal with the national interest and make judgments about what is necessary. And it also points the government to consulting with opposition leaders on anything that comes up during the campaign.
Right. Okay, that's an interesting point, consulting with opposition leaders. But for example, if you had a big natural disaster like a wildfire that threatens a population center, you still can do all of your executive. That's a public safety issue, and you would
global pandemic in 2021.
Exactly.
Stephen Harper during the 2015 campaign, which was one I know fairly well, dealt with ISIS, the Syrian migration. He had negotiators at the Pacific trade discussions because the negotiations weren't going to wait for Canada. So, the idea is you take care of as much government business as you feel is necessary in the national interest.
How do you deal with a trade war? Because April 2nd is looming. That's going to be in the middle of the campaign. Donald Trump is going to take action. I mean, does it limit their ability to apply the second wave of reciprocal tariffs? What are the restrictions and limitations there?
Well, the point is all of the laws are in place and the toolkit is there. The shock absorbers for the economy are there. The powers of the various ministers are there. The only thing really not available to the government would be to go to Parliament and pass a new law. I don't really see that that's going to be much of an issue, that you would need a brand new piece of legislation in the next 6 weeks.
But maybe it's only a political problem if they were to take action like applying new tariffs or going to Washington for meetings. Are these things that would be considered out of bounds in a normal caretaker convention?
No, clearly you have to act. It's the national government and it's there to act in the national interest. There's a lot of judgment required, and one of the parts of the convention is to try to separate government business from partisan politicking. So if you're in the middle of a campaign and you're going to meetings and events or you're on the news a lot because of the tariffs, people will get a bit edgy about that. But we just went through the Ontario election, and you saw the Premier of Ontario going about his business as Premier while conducting a campaign.
Yeah, but he has no foreign policy responsibility, right? As the Premier of Ontario, that was, kind of convenient in some ways for the Ontario PCs politically. The federal government is responsible for trade, foreign policy. So does it change the expectations?
No, in my view, no. I mean, the Trade Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Finance Minister, the Border Services Minister, they have all of their powers and all of the tools in their tool set. and they will be answerable to Parliament for how they use them, when Parliament reconvenes in May.
Okay, so the $125 billion, for example, the second wave of retaliatory tariffs that has been put in abeyance, depending on whatever Donald Trump does in April 2nd. Well, I guess it would be Minister Champagne now as the new finance minister. He could trigger that without challenge. Would that be something that requires consultation with the opposition parties, whereas previously known? I mean, what level of consultation? What would be the threshold for that?
There's no black and white rule book. The convention suggests you should consult opposition leaders on big ticket issues that are in the national interest. There's nothing stopping the Prime Minister or his ministers from getting on a secure phone and talking to any of the premiers or any of the opposition leaders during the campaign.
What about if they are going to take extra trade action or support action for workers beyond what has been announced that they can do through their regulatory authorities? For example, changes to employment insurance, or a third tranche of retaliatory tariffs. Should they talk to Mr. Poilievre, Mr. Singh, Mr. Blanchet, or is that something they'd be okay to do?
They're not obliged to, but the convention points them and nudges them towards consulting the other party leaders, and that's why it's important for all of the party leaders to have security clearances and be able to take briefings from officials on matters that are in the national interest.
Okay, you just mentioned security clearances, and that's going to stand out to people because this has been one of the issues in this campaign, is that Mr. Poilievre, he had security clearance as a cabinet minister, but these lapse over time, so you do have to be revetted and renewed. He has not gotten a security clearance to deal with the foreign interference challenges, and read the NSI COP report. This has been a persistent attack from the Liberals. Does that in any way affect his ability to be consulted during this sort of period?
Well, it would limit the ability to share really high-grade intelligence, so that might be more relevant to the Ukraine situation or Gaza or other foreign policy issues that pop up during the next 6 weeks. In terms of the trade war, I don't think it's really limiting a discussion about where to go next in terms of tariffs or retaliation. I think is certainly something that they can talk about. My view is that Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Carney should have each other on speed dial.
Do you think that is a likely thing based on all of your experience in the public service? It seems unlikely to me.
Well, you can ask them. The Germans just went through a 2-month election campaign in the shadow of Trump and tariffs and the Ukraine war and Putin. And they were able to go out on the campaign trail and go at each other in front of voters and have debates and argue why they were the best person to form the next government. But they also collaborated a lot during the campaign and as soon as it was over.
The usual outcome, though, in German elections is a coalition government of some kind, right? So it's a different political culture in terms of, here coalition is kind of a dirty word, certainly has been throughout this parliament in terms of the way the supply and confidence agreement worked, or at least from the conservative perspective. Do you think that partisan environment limits the ability to work together on these things in the face of something like Donald Trump, like looking to the German example?
Well, this is stretches well beyond the 6 weeks of the election.
Of course,
I think in the face of existential threats from Donald Trump and his government, we're going to need a lot more collaboration and conversation across party lines.
One last question for you. I remember your comments in the past about what's happening in terms of the public safety environment, that politics is happening. We've seen a lot more threats, a lot more people resigning. Social media has become possibly worse than when you're concerned in the past. When you look at the misinformation, harassment, disinformation environment right now, I mean, the foreign interference laws are not passed. Like the safeguarding has not happened. How certain are you that this election is ready for what it may face?
Well, I think people will do the best they can with the tools they have. Elections Canada will do what it can. It is really disappointing that the last Parliament dropped the ball. They could have passed Bill C-65, but they turned it into theatre about pensions. The bill they did pass on foreign interference is not in place. So we're going to go into the election with shields down compared to what could have been, but they'll do their best. I think the biggest issue in the upcoming campaign is not going to be sort of physical violence and so on. That's a part of politics, as you say. It's disinformation. It's the Elon Musk. It's the social media world. It's people trying to sow division in our country by spreading disinformation, and that's very difficult to defend against.
Yeah, it's an enormous challenge, especially with the retreat of traditional media and it being constantly under attack. Michael Wernick, I always appreciate the time. This is Michael Wernick, former clerk of the Privy Council. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.